This lecture is about fermentation, and I'll show you some different types of cellular respiration. Fermentation is a way to make some ATP without requiring oxygen. So, when a cell, many cells in our body can do both cellular respiration or fermentation. What I want you to notice here is that glycolysis is the first reaction for both. So we're taking glucose, converting it to pyruvate. And then the question is, which path will the pyruvate go? So if your cell has oxygen, it's going to do aerobic respiration because you make lots of ATP. If no oxygen is present or very little, the cell will choose to do fermentation. Our cells do lactic acid fermentation. Yeast can do ethanol fermentation. Okay. So let's look. What I want you to understand is this can happen in the presence of O2. So I hate the no, but if there's enough O2, our cells are going to choose to do aerobic respiration because you make so much more ATP. So here's the two types of fermentation. Lactic acid is on the left, ethanol, alcohol fermentation is on the right. So our body does lactic acid fermentation, which means we take the glucose, we make some ATP, we make pyruvate, and then what happens to that pyruvate is it's converted into lactic acid. Lactate is the same as lactic acid. And the point of this is to take the electron carrier NADH and oxidize it. So it loses its electrons and you have more NAD plus to go through glycolysis again. Some cells, like yeast, so beer and wine production, take glucose, make pyruvate, and then the pyruvate is broken down to acetaldehyde, and you have CO2 released, which is the bubbles in your beer or wine, and alcohol produced, ethanol in this case. Okay. Our cells do not do this. Okay. No matter what you think, you cannot get drunk off of consuming sugar. Now, there are some people who have a condition where they actually are infected with yeast, and the yeast will produce alcohol, and they get drunk by their metabolism, but it's not their metabolism, I should say. It's by the yeast metabolism in their body. So both processes are taking NADH and oxidizing it back to NAD+. The whole point of fermentation is to make a little bit of energy, but also to regenerate the electron carriers. Okay, so this is just showing you, again, to emphasize, the point of fermentation is to regenerate NAD+. Because if your cell runs out of NAD+, then it cannot do glycolysis and it cannot make ATP. Okay? And that's true for lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation. What I want you to see here is when you get a buildup of lactate or lactic acid, this can be dangerous, and some people think this is why we feel the burn when you go into anaerobic exercise. So your muscles have used up all the oxygen, they switch to fermentation, they make lactic acid, and people say this is how you feel the burn. What's interesting is this buildup of acid can be very dangerous. And so our brain cells, which do use lots of oxygen, do lots of glycolysis, do not express the pathway for lactic acid fermentation because it's so dangerous. If that lactate builds up, it can actually kill your cells. So instead, what does our body do? It takes all your blood when you're low on oxygen and pushes it to the brain so that the brain can continue to do aerobic respiration. This is another reason why you increase your rate of breathing when you're exercising. So your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up, and what it's trying to do is get more oxygen in there so that you don't have to go into fermentation. Last slide I want to show you is a comparison of aerobic respiration, which is what happens in our mitochondria, fermentation, which can happen in some of our cells, and anaerobic respiration, which only happens in prokaryotes. Okay. So aerobic respiration, our cellular respiration, uses oxygen as the final electron acceptor. That's why it's aerobic. You produce a lot of ATP. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes can do this. Okay. Fermentation is the other thing both prokaryotes and eukaryotes can do, but look, you only produce 2 ATP. So you're going to run out of energy pretty fast because you're going to use up all that glucose. Some prokaryotes live in anaerobic environments. That means without oxygen. So their respiration is the same, it's just that they use something different than oxygen as the final electron acceptor. And the amount of ATP produced during anaerobic respiration varies widely depending on the pathway. So, you've got aerobic respiration, you have fermentation, and then some prokaryotes can do anaerobic respiration. That's it for that one.